Good day, everybody, and thank you very much for joining me on episode 70 of Untold Evidence. Today, our journey starts on the 27th of October, 1962. Deep under the Atlantic, a Soviet submarine carried a nuclear weapon, a captain who believed the war might have already begun, and one officer who refused to agree. The submarine was called B-59. And this day was one of the most dangerous days in one of the most dangerous periods of the 20th century. And the officer who refused was a man named Vasili Arkhipov. Now this follows on a little bit from our last episode about how one man seemed to have stopped nuclear war. We then rise to find another man that may have just stopped nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis is often remembered as a standoff of leaders, Kennedy in Washington, Khrushchev in Moscow, two men and a tense conversation spanning across the world. But the crisis was not the only happening in these two rooms. It was a happening in the ocean. And on the day history would later call Black Saturday, the 27th of October, it very nearly happened under the water. B-59 was a Soviet submarine, a diesel-electric boat, one of several sent towards Cuba as the crisis built. And the crews of those submarines were carrying something their American counterparts did not fully realize. Each of those boats had aboard it a torpedo armed with a nuclear warhead. Now by the 27th of October, conditions aboard the B-59 had become close to unbearable. The submarine had been hiding, submerged, for a long stretch of time. The air inside was going foul. The temperature in parts of the boats had climbed to a degree that is genuinely hard to imagine working in. The crew was exhausted, overheated, and starved of clean air. And they were blind. Deep underwater, B-59 could not easily receive radio signals from Moscow. The men inside did not know what was happening in the world above them. They did not know if the crisis had cooled. They did not know if it had ignited. For all they could tell, the war might have already started or even ended. Then the depth charges began. American naval ships on the surface had located the submarines. They were dropping what were in fact practice depth charges, small signalling charges, meant to force a submarine to surface and identify itself. But the men inside the B-59 did not know that they were practice charges. To them, sealed in a hot steel tub, it sounded like they were being attacked. Now imagine making the most important decision in human history in that room, hot, airless and blind, and you believe you're under fire. The captain of B-59, Valentin Savitsky, reached a conclusion. If they were being attacked, then perhaps the war had begun, and if the war had begun, the nuclear torpedo was there to be used. But there was a safeguard, and the safeguard on that day was human. By the accounts that have been pieced together, the launch of the nuclear torpedo required the agreement of the senior officers on board. And here is a detail that made all the difference. On board the B-59, by chance, was not only the submarine's captain, Vasili Arkhipov, the chief of staff of the entire flotilla, a man of equal rank to the captain, and his agreement was needed. Savitsky, by these accounts, wanted to launch. The boat's political officer was reportedly willing. Yet Vasili Arkhipov said no. He argued for restraint. He argued that they did not know the war had begun, that the charges might be signals rather than attacks, and the right action was to surface, make contact, and find out, rather than fire a nuclear weapon into uncertainty. And he held that line in that hot and frightened room against his own captain. B-59 surfaced. No nuclear torpedo was launched. The submarine was challenged by American ships and eventually turned back. And it's worth saying plainly, Arkhipov was a man that was not unfamiliar with catastrophe. He had served aboard another Soviet submarine, the K-19, during a serious reactor accident the year before. He had seen what crisis can do to a man and a machine. When he argued for restraint, he was not naive. He was, if anything, the most experienced man in the room, staring at the disaster that was in the face of him. Now, as always, the careful part, because this story, like the Petrov story, is often told with more certainty than the evidence fully allows. First, the precise details of what happened inside the B-59, the exact words, the exact sequence, even the exact rule that 3 officials had to agree, have been assembled from the limited sources. Some of them came to light decades later, around the 40th anniversary of the crisis. Submarine crews did not keep public diaries. Historians have done careful work here, but parts of the scene, honestly, reconstructed rather than filmed. Second, because of that, the most dramatic framing, that the torpedo was seconds away from launch, and Archipov's single word was all that stopped it, should be held a little loosely. What is solid is the structure of the situation, not necessarily the knife-edge timing of the popular retelling. But here is what is not in doubt, and it is more than enough. The B-59 was real. The nuclear torpedoes aboard it were real. The unbearable conditions were real. The depth charges were real. And the fact that the boat surfaced without launching is real. And Vasili Arkhipov, a senior officer with the standing to influence that outcome, was aboard and favoured restraint. You do not need the most cinematic version to be sobered by this. A nuclear weapon was at sea inside a hull full of exhausted, half-suffocated men who believed they might be under attack and could not call home. That situation existed. And it resolved towards restraint, with Archipov's hand firmly in it. The honest version is quieter than the legend, and it should still keep you up at night. So even with the counter-argument, and even if we soften his role, I don't think it is unfair to say that yet again, one man truly did stand in the way of catastrophe. Now, whether if it was escalated higher or in any other means, and it could have changed history, that's up for doubt. But we know, with all the documentation in this world we live in today, both Petrov in the episode before and Arkhipov in our episode today showed real restraint and sense to stop an inevitable world war. What the story of the B-59 really shows is where history actually turns, not only in the famous rooms, in the infamous ones, in a hot steel tube under the Atlantic with no one watching, and no one who would ever have known. If that torpedo had been launched, the men of the B-59 would almost certainly not have lived to explain why. The decision would not have been made in the dark, and its reasons would have died with the people who had made it. Instead, a man argued for surfacing, for waiting, for finding out before firing. And because of that, the worst day of the Cold War stayed a day the world survived. Vasili Arkhipov died in 1998, and the world did not learn what he might owe them until a year after he was gone. More on Black Saturday and the submarines of the crisis is in the description below. Tell me what you think, and tell me anything about the Cold War that unsettles you the most, and we'll give it some inspiration for the next episode. And as ever, if we've misrepresented or misinformed, please let us know and give us the evidence so we can make our production even better. Thank you very much for following. Please like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next episode.